That's Debatable is sponsored by MB&G. MB&G are specialists in the esoteric world of vehicle and furniture warranty insurance, delivering quite marvellous customer service, prompt claims payment, and a highly developed understanding of how to deliver these products in a way that is both compliant with the regulations and attractive to customers. To find out more, call Paul Smith, the Managing Director, on 07887 501 441. That's 07887 501 441. Hello and welcome to That's Debatable, the weekly news podcast of the Free Speech Union. Welcome back to all of our listeners, welcome back to all of our viewers, and good to see you again. Ben, I realise that in our introduction we say this is a weekly news podcast, but I think we've turned it in the last month or so, we've turned it into a fortnightly podcast. But there's a very, very good reason for that, which is we have had the most astonishingly busy 4 weeks, 5 weeks, really since the very beginning of August. And as was mentioned in this month's, or the one that's just gone out, the newsletter, the monthly newsletter that went out this morning, actually, so we're recording this on Monday, we have had more than 4,000 new sign-ups to the Free Speech Union since the beginning of August, which is quite an astonishing number. And what's happening, of course, is that those are coming in the front door, all of those new people, which is brilliant. And then that's a significant proportion of eking through into your world, Ben, I think, where people are raising concerns, queries. Where are we with free speech in the United Kingdom at the moment after all of the issues that have hit the table following online comments getting people into terrible trouble, up to and including prison, the cancellation of the Higher Education Act, people really wondering where they stand. But you're really hot from the front line, aren't you, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, of these 4,000, it's good to be back, by the way, but of those 4,000, I think it is a rally around the flag effect. And it made me think of one of the lines just before Henry V's Agincourt speech, where one of the noblemen is wishing that we had 1/10,000 of those men now abed in England who do no work this day. And it seems to me that 1/10,000 have woken up and they've joined the Free Speech Union. So welcome to the FSU.
Welcome to the FSU. And it's great to have our regular listeners and our new listeners. And we will be intending, I think, Ben, to continue to release a podcast weekly. We're always thinking about how we manage the weekly news podcast, whether we have a slightly shorter episode when there's less news, or what listeners prefer to get. But we are hopefully now going to be back at every week. And we should kick off, I think, with our first item, which is, well, this is a saga. I mean, this is a saga. I was thinking about this before we switched on the microphones, Ben. A saga of the akin to Beowulf, the saga of the non-crime hate incident, or we will now call it the NCHI. We always forget. We talk about NCHIs so frequently, we often forget to explain exactly what they are. And I was looking, they go all the way back to the Lawrence inquiry, actually, where at that time, one of the findings was we need to understand incidents that may not be criminal, but things that are going on in communities that could lead to the sort of racism that led to that tragic death back in the 1990s. And the first proper code of practice, I think, was issued to the police quite a few years later, 2014. And once that code of practice on non-crime hate incidents had been introduced, what happened in the background was a whole bunch of NCHIs got recorded by different police forces in different ways. But I think at one point, the estimate was over the next 4 or 5 years from 2014, it got up to something like 250,000 or nearly up to that level. And the case, the landmark case that really was our first big fight in this NCHI pond was that of Harry Miller, who got an NCHI after a police officer came round and questioned what he considered to be a transphobic tweet, and came round and used that wonderful phrase that shall resonate through free speech history forevermore. the police officer said, "I've come round to check your thinking." And we're not going to mention George Orwell, but nevertheless, listeners and viewers will draw the right strands out of that particular conversation. Obviously, Harry was appalled. He was himself an ex-police officer. This was a police officer who came round from the Humberside Constabulary and pursued it all the way up to and including an investigation into the College of Policing's code of conduct, and saying, essentially that needs to be reviewed. You can't be putting these out there to the extent that the police officers were. And one of the key reasons behind that was that if an NCHI, which is a non-crime hate incident, gets put against your name, goes onto your file, you go in to apply for a job as a teacher or in another sort of sensitive role in care where you may be dealing with vulnerable people, this NCHI shows up on a criminal record search, an enhanced, I can't remember exactly what they're called, Ben.
Yeah, that's it, an enhanced DBS.
DBS.
There's quite a few acronyms in this. I think the point you made right at the beginning there, Tom, about NCHI, non-crime hate incident, I actually think there's something to be said for not using the acronym whatsoever, because it disguises, I think, how sinister these things actually are. And when you're forced to say non-crime hate incident being recorded by the police, I think then that really hits home what that will actually mean for people. And as you've just said, it will mean that people are denied jobs, that job offers fall through, that they can't volunteer working with children or vulnerable adults. And one of the most sinister aspects of all of this, of course, is that you may well not know that an NCHI has been recorded against you. It might be something that you said to your neighbour 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago that is lingering dormant on a police file somewhere. And only when you apply for a job, only then does your prospective employer discover that this NCHI is on your record. And then the whole thing can fall through. It can ruin your life.
Especially in these days, Ben, your point about saying it as it is and getting the absurdity of this thing out there, saying the whole word, non-crime, or the whole phrase, non-crime hate incident, especially in these times when the government clearly is trying to bring them back. So another big win last year was that the Home Secretary issued a new code of conduct, really trying to establish a statutory basis for these, or a more secure basis for these, so that they were not just going to be issued for things where they weren't proportionate to the situation. And in that guidance were a number of examples of where police officers should record an NCHI and where they should not report an NCHI. We even questioned that because it was clear there was some bias in the way, not the original guidance that had been issued by the Home Secretary, but the interpretation of that guidance by the College of Policing was biased, very much tilted towards sort of transgender ideology and against gender critical views. So there was probably no surprise there. So we challenged that. But what the Home Secretary has now said is that we are actually going to have to record more of these, and essentially turned it into this political football and said this was a Tory idea that we should tone down the recording of NCHIs, and the Labour government is not going to do that because of Islamophobia and because of anti-Semitism. We've got to get that recording back so that we can protect communities and vulnerable people. And the reality is it wasn't a political football issue. It was very much coming out of the Harry Miller finding, saying this doesn't really have the right statutory basis for the way that police officers are recording it. And so the new code of conduct came out of that environment and the final finding out of the Harry Miller saga. And it didn't come out of a purely politically driven, ideologically driven view of one side of the house against another side of the house. And that's been lost, I think, Ben, in the debate.
Well, and this is a theme that's going to come back again in this episode, and I'm sure over the lifetime of this parliament, in that all of these attacks that the government has made on free speech over the last 2 months, so often we have seen the language of oh, this is the Tories' hate speech charter, which was the description by a government source of the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act. Couldn't be further from the truth. So too with the resurrection of the zombie NCHI regime. I think perhaps just to give some context, Tom, just to give some examples of what sorts of things might actually be captured by an NCHI, because we've described it as sinister, we've described it as absurd, but I think to actually give some examples of what this regime did when it was in force before the code of practice substantially watered it down. So in June 2022, Wiltshire police opened a non-crime hate incident file when an 11-year-old boy was called Shorty and Leprechaun in the street by another boy. Hampshire police dispatched 5 officers to arrest Army veteran Darren Brady following a complaint that he'd posted a meme created by Lawrence Fox depicting the pride flag as a swastika. There's also the Wakefield Quran Gate incident in which a schoolboy lightly scuffed his own copy of the Quran. That was recorded as a non-crime hate incident originally, although we managed to get that particular record removed. It goes on and on. There's a list on our Twitter feed at Speech Union. You can go and see some of the ludicrous examples of NCHIs that we have dealt with and seen and that have been reported. There was a man, I'll just give one more. A man was landed with a police record for racial hatred for whistling the Bob the Builder theme tune at his neighbour, which was recorded as an NCHI, which will remain on file for 6 years and, as we've described, would be disclosed to prospective employers. Absurd.
We've gone back, haven't we? Toby Young, our General Secretary, has reconnected with Harry Miller, who established Fair Cop after his particular legal battle, and he kind of completely changed the direction of what he does and his life, really. But to pick up on your point about the absurdity of the NCHIs, this is why Toby and Harry have got together and jointly written a letter to Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, to make exactly that point. They were going down an absurd road. They had no statutory basis. This new code of conduct was not a politically driven thing that was rolled out, and you can't just overturn it without it being in danger of breaking the law. In fact, and really going against Article 10, which was the core basis of the finding, Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which establishes and protects our right to freedom of expression. So we are going to fight. This is another area where we are going to fight, and we are going to make it crystal clear to the government that there are legal implications and legal repercussions from just going back and overturning this willy-nilly, that are somewhat akin to what we're saying on the situation with the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, though obviously different. So yeah, we're going back into fight for that one as well.
There's a particular context here, which is that the NCHI regime is being resurrected in order to focus on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Let me just deal briefly with the anti-Semitism point. Now, I think all of us have seen many shocking examples of, let's take the marches that have been taking place in London for almost a complete year now. We're speaking on the 2nd of September, so 11 months, of rancid, shocking anti-Semitism. There does need to be freedom to criticize the state of Israel. It's absolutely abundant that Israelis have no hesitation in exercising that right, as they are at the moment. But nonetheless, there must be that right in the United Kingdom. And there is a distinction between some of what we've seen on those protests versus legitimate criticism of individual Israeli government actions, and so on. There is a danger of those two things becoming conflated and criticism of Israel becoming censored. I think that is a risk, and it must remain lawful for people to be able to criticize Israel. I say that as somebody who has absolutely no hesitation in affirming and upholding Israel's right to exist and to defend itself. On Islamophobia, the government is committed, the Labour Party at least is committed to the all-party parliamentary group on British Muslims definition of Islamophobia. Now, Islamophobia is a nonsense term from the outset and a mendacious term. It conflates criticism of Islam with abuse of Muslims in the streets. It treats both of those phenomena as being the same thing, and they're not. But this definition in particular is something that we've spoken about extensively in previous episodes. But when you have this very broad definition that captures all sorts of legitimate criticisms of Islam and Islamic practices, and you link it to the NCHI regime, you have a recipe for all sorts of people, really a limitless number of people, having these records marked against their name, which they may never know about, wrecking their job offers, their careers, removing opportunities to volunteer, whatever it might be, all because they've expressed views that are entirely lawful. There's one particular point that alarms me most about this, and I'm just going to quote from the definition now. It gives examples of what might be deemed to be Islamophobic, and one of those is using the symbols and images associated with classic Islamophobia. Examples given of that are Muhammad being a paedophile, claims of Muslims spreading Islam by the sword, or subjugating minority groups under their rule. Now, it is simply a brute fact of the historical record that Islam was spread by the sword. It is absolutely undeniable that that is the case. Now, if making that claim is going to be treated as Islamophobic, and if Islamophobia is going to be something that is met with, at the very least, a non-crime hate incident, of course, it might well become a criminal matter. There are literally books on the shelves behind me written by mainstream reputable historians who have documented the spread, written about the spread of Muhammad's followers following his death, conquests made in Muhammad's own life as well, which you could easily imagine. Indeed, it must be the case, if the rules were applied fairly, that the authors of those books and people who repeat the claims in them will have NCHIs, non-crime hate incidents, recorded against them. That must be the implication of coupling up the Islamophobia definition with the NCHI regime. And so the potential for harm that is going to cause to freedom of speech is absolutely vast.
All of which is why we exist. Going back to how we open the episode, with all of our new members, with all of the support, and I didn't mention the donations that we've received, for which we are immensely grateful. We've been fighting against this NCHI. You mentioned the old zombie regime. We fought against the zombie regime. We thought we'd brought in a new regime. We are going to continue to fight. We know that advances can be swept away very quickly, but the key thing when an advance is swept away very quickly, the key thing is not to give up. The key thing is to get back up and continue the fight. So, we are going to keep this, get Toby getting back together with Harry to send this letter. We're going to keep on putting the pressure on the government to set the record straight, remind them of why we got to where we got to last year and why we can't just sweep them away. As you say, it would be catastrophic for freedom of expression in the UK, which is not in a great place anyway. And on that point, obviously the other big area that we've been fighting is against the pausing of the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act. And we have begun the proceedings of a judicial review. We've written that letter into the Home Secretary to say that we are going to put that decision under the scrutiny of a judicial review. And the government's own lawyers last week, we were informed that one of the reasons that vice chancellors lobbied the government for the pausing of that act was that it might cause difficulties in relation to to countries such as China, countries where they are now getting a lot of money, a lot of students. And they positioned it as they were worried about those instances where our institutions are delivering English courses in foreign countries where they have restrictions on freedom of speech. So they're saying, we have an outpost over here. We can't be expected to uphold freedom of speech in the way that we would if it was happening here in the UK. But I think, Ben, there's some truth to that reality. But honestly, this is another excuse from the higher education sector to say we don't really want this because it just makes it awkward for those who give us our money and where our funds come from.
It's absolutely extraordinary and astonishing, I think, to imagine any leader of a university, anybody at the top of the sector, Russell Group, university heads and so on, actually saying out loud or committing to writing that the reason freedom of speech protections cannot be uprated and enhanced in the United Kingdom is because it will upset the Chinese Communist Party. And yet that is the reason that has been given or that has emerged for the government's decision to try and wreck the act, to try and stop it coming into effect. The explanation, as you've just said, Tom, is about satellite campuses overseas. But we know already from our own casework that actually the approach of the Chinese Communist Party to freedom of speech, which I apologize, that's an incredibly euphemistic way of putting it. That approach that is already infecting how British universities in Britain deal with academic freedom. And I'd point to the case of our member Michelle Shipworth, who, as listeners and viewers and readers of our newsletter will know, was removed from teaching her own module at UCL because she had asked the question, this isn't verbatim, but to the effect of how many slaves are there, modern slaves in China, in the context of a data analysis.
Well, why are there
module.
so many slaves in China, wasn't it?
Asking, that's exactly it. Asking students to analyze a data set on modern slavery. And that has triggered an extraordinary process in which she has been de facto punished for having the temerity to ask that particular question. So this is not something that is a kind of fringe issue of the unique case of satellite campuses of British universities operating abroad. This is already happening in Britain because the sector is so dependent on Chinese students particularly. And as customers, I mean, the other process that people would point to, perhaps from the left, is the marketization of higher education. They say, well, that when you create a system where students are customers, the customer's always right. You can't irk your customers. You've got to appease them, and so those two things have coincided, and they have brought us to this really astonishing moment where it was reported, as you've just summarised, that this is the reason that the Higher Education Act, and one of the reasons that the Act has had to be paused pending complete destruction of the legislation and sabotage of it. It really is astonishing. It's one of those things, Tom, where one does feel lost for words. That anybody could be so craven as to think this is the basis for doing it. It's astonishing.
I was talking to a friend about this, and you mentioned the customer is always right. And I think we came to the conclusion that it depends who the customer is. If you're a non-woke customer in a bank, or if you're a non-woke customer anywhere else, really, then your customer is always wrong. But if you're a customer with a very deep pocket, who thereby has a significant amount of influence and power over the institution, particularly a higher education institution, then the customer is always right. So the customer is always right, but it depends. Are you rich, and do you believe the right thing? Though I have to say, the CCP probably doesn't believe the right thing, but they're very, very rich. So, yeah, I mean, the customer is always right. Like, oh, we live in a free country, and like many other phrases that you and I grew up with, I think we're going to have to retire, adapt, or evolve because of the new world in which we live. But it is an absolutely very, very soul-destroying place for both you and me. I suppose we've obviously we owe a lot to the higher education institutions that educated us, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners and a lot of our viewers feel exactly the same. You know, they owe a lot to the British higher education system, which has been the envy of the world for so long, genuinely the envy of the world, and how many great scientists, Nobel winners, Nobel Prize winners, great literature, great social scientists. And this is where our institutions are, is soul destroying. But we're fighting on. We're fighting on with the JR, with the judicial review.
We're fighting on. And I have to say, you're absolutely right. That residual loyalty that you feel to the university you went to. But I think people really, in the last 4 years particularly, have got to the end of their tether with that.
Agreed.
And I think that goodwill has entirely evaporated now, because every institution is playing at this stuff and decolonizing. And one of the points about Michelle Shipworth's case that I reflect on quite frequently was, of course, the fixation of modern universities with the issue of slavery, and it's all couched in moralistic terms, which I would say are actually quite inappropriate to any study of history, but nonetheless it is. And yet, when they are presented with this abhorrent practice actually taking place today, in our world right now, in our time, when they're actually given the opportunity to do something about it, not only do they fail to take this opportunity, but they say you can't even ask questions about it.
Yeah. It's armchair concern about historical slavery, because if people were genuinely riled up about, as you say, the abhorrent practice of slavery, then the modern day slavery, the people who today, now, as we are recording, are existing in a state of slavery around the world, and their ongoing suffering, about which those of us who are alive to do today could do something. There's not necessarily a lot of practical things we can do in certain areas of the world, obviously, but actually we could get a movement going, or if we really felt something about that, we could get a movement going, and all that energy that gets put into decolonization could be pointed in that direction. That would make a difference. That would make a difference to lives that are still going on. And it is very odd that there is this apathy around what's going on right now, this sort of, well, I can't do anything about it, and so all of that energy, and I think that is a feature of woke culture, is how much energy is put into things that just don't matter really, or are false fears. We talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion. So much energy is poured into those courses. So much energy is poured into decolonization. So much energy is poured into rewriting our history. And yet so little energy is poured into things that could make real difference to people's lives today. And actually, I mean, basic things, what they eat, whether they can drink, and whether they have accommodation over their heads, and whether they can live in a free society as well, sort of secondary freedoms. But it's just so I have barely scratched the surface of that. I mean, that's a PhD plus some to investigate what's going on in that part of our ongoing.
Not that you get the funding to do such a PhD.
You'd never get it, would you? You'd never get it. To do the PhD into that, you'd have to pass several preliminary tests, which you would fail. Which actually leads us on to our next point.
It does,
Ben, which is switching out.
Well, hang on. Before you get onto it, Tom, I think we do need to say to the 6 people who are still listening to this, who are still holding on, who still have some faith that free speech can be restored in Britain, bear with us, because things are about to get a little bit worse. The hope then is that they will get better in the fullness of time. But this one, it's pretty aggravating. Tom, go into it. But I just wanted to give that trigger warning to people, because it's pretty ranted stuff, actually, this, isn't it?
It's aggravating and it's batty. We're moving out of the sort of higher education sector and into the school education sector, and particularly the teacher training sector, where new, I don't know what the right phrase is, codes of practice, guidance, perhaps, I think is right, both in Scotland and in England, anti-racist codes or pieces of guidance have been issued and actually supported by pretty significant institutions, including unions, about being anti-racist, and in particular disrupting the centrality of whiteness. And I mean, we can come on to some of the words that they are saying should be not eliminated from the classroom, but questioned within the classroom. When I was talking about this last week, Ben, disrupting the centrality of whiteness, I learned a lot about the kings and queens of England. And so if you decided you wanted to take whiteness out of the kings and queens of England, you're essentially just going to run the camera against an empty balcony outside probably Buckingham Palace, or whichever palace our king or our queen happened to live in at the time, Hampton Court or wherever. It's an empty balcony. They're gone. Our history is gone if we just take the centrality. I know by whiteness, they mean a system. They mean the oppressed and the oppressor. They mean victimhood, all of these terrible things that are have infected everything. But it is absurd. And the words, before I'll hand the baton on to you in a minute, Ben, but the words that they say we should question are meritocracy, objectivity, and individualism. And I'll just stop on individualism actually there, because I think that's really interesting. I am a great believer in individualism. And actually, I think this is something about England and Scotland. I mean, about the British. We are very individualistic. We have the crazies amongst us. We're all a little bit, being English, we're a bit eccentric. So individualism cuts through being English.
Yes.
Always has. And it's also how you make progress, by being an individual. You break away from the herd and you find something out that's never been found out before. And so the individualism I find really interesting. And the last thing I was going to say about individualism, of course, is that if you're talking about left and right of politics as well, those towards the centre-right tend to eschew a view of history, or a view of walking through society, actually, or politics, that is group-based. They tend to say, leave it to the individual, whether it's economically, to make money, build a business, employ people, succeed, whether it's culturally, change the pattern, become an oasis from the 1990s, our individualistic musicians who broke through and changed the way that our music sounds and the way that our culture resonates across the world. It comes from individualism. And so I find it really interesting. That's one of the words they say we should question it, because if you're an individual, you're not in a group. And the whole thing about the new world is being in a group.
On the subject, firstly, of English eccentricity, I spent much of yesterday, Sunday, at a medieval fair. And I can tell you, Tom, there was no shortage of eccentricity there. There were some quite remarkable people there, in fact, with some rather striking costumes and a commitment to the characters in which they were role-playing. And I was wandering around that, and I thought, how many countries have people this balmy? And thank God for the English. Yeah. It was extraordinary. It was great fun. Some real characters. And I wondered how on earth you go back to your day job if you've spent your weekend practicing horseback archery or jousting or fighting in an arena wearing full plate armor. It must be quite difficult then to go back to being an accountant or whatever.
I'm sure they wear the armor in the next day to see their first client as they're doing their first tax return.
This is the thing with the English, though. I think you never quite know what's going on with people under the surface. People have all sorts of weird interests and hobbies, and we are a great nation of hobbyists and eccentricity. So yes, I share your well, I think this targeting of individualism is very, very creepy. Yes. That's what I feel about it. And it suggests this Borg-like universalism. And obviously the production of the end result of teacher training programs like this is going to be drone-like teachers who have no flair, often who lack subject knowledge, and who have been thoroughly indoctrinated in a belief system, and with the sense that their imperative is not to educate, but it is to pass on this new true faith to the children and indeed the other teachers who they come across. And I can say, I'm afraid, with some real evidence behind it from the people that we've spoken to in schools, teachers, parents, governors, all sorts of people in primary and secondary schools, that you can see the issues of when people do come through teacher training programs like this, or when people are trying to get through teacher training programs while resisting this sort of ideology, that this stuff is absolutely everywhere. I have a child who's about to start primary school this week. So, all of these things are very much on my mind. Fortunately, it seems to be a very sensible school. But the thought of having to entrust the state under this government with teacher training programs like this going on, and guidance produced by teaching unions like this, preparing the next generation of teachers. I mean, it just fills you with horror, the thought of having to get children through 14 years of schooling in these conditions. Will they have any attachment to the eccentricity or the individualism or the history, the balminess that I saw in rich display at this medieval fair, and to all of these traditions that go back so many centuries?
Of course, most parents would then, as a solution to that, say, if the state system's gone crazy, well, at least we have the private system. But as we know from our casework, it doesn't take a long to delve into the data of our casework. You discover actually private schools are often on the very front line of this stuff, are the first to be decolonizing their curricula, because they're looking around their buildings and they're looking around their benefactors and they're looking around where their money originally came from, and they're just feeling guilty. They're just thinking, oh my goodness, we need to do the mea culpa thing first before someone else pulls us out.
I mean, it's class as well. I mean, I don't think there's any group of people who are more susceptible to following fads and fashions than the upper middle class. And so private schools have every financial incentive to chase after and to reproduce the doctrines of the new faith in their institutions. That's why, as you said, it's the elite universities, it's the top private schools who are really at the cutting edge of this. If you're running a state primary or secondary school and you're dealing with budget cuts and staff shortages and overcrowded classrooms and all the rest of it, you probably don't have a huge amount of time to be thinking about enforcing this stuff. You might be dealing with a generation of teachers who come in and do want to enforce it, and that might be a problem that you're having to contend with. But you just probably don't have the capacity unless you are ideologically motivated to do it. And most people, I think, lack those kinds of commitments. Most people actually just want to get on with things. That's just not the way you're going to think about it. But for those fee-paying institutions, they really are very, 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 very hot on chasing these cultural currents and looking fashionable and attractive and modern.
Before we end the episode, Ben, I think we should mention, especially with so many new joiners, a really interesting event that is coming up next week on Thursday, the 12th of September at 7:30 p.m. London and online, and all the details we will put into the show notes. But it's called The War Against the Past, Why the West Must Fight for Its History. And that is an introduction to Professor Frank Furedi's new book. And he's going to be there, and he's going to be talking to us about that book. And it is so relevant to what we've been discussing today. Why the West must fight for its history, this war against our past, whether it's whiteness, whether it's the kings and queens that we've talked about, whether it's higher education institutions not wanting to teach subjects the way they have for millennia. And there's going to be a response by the historian, Professor Jonathan Clark, and for those in person, there will be a wine reception, and before that, a Q&A as well. So I'm sure if you're online, you'll be there for the Q&A, but you might have to open your own bottle of wine. So we'll put a link into that, but that's next Thursday, the 12th of September, 7:30 p.m. Do sign up for that. Frank Furedi is amazing. I've heard him speak multiple times, and he always sort of makes you, obviously makes you think and gives you a new perspective on all of these things. So very excited about that. But do you have anything else to add on that?
Well, I do. Just to say, if you've got through all of this episode, you might be feeling a bit gloomy. We do try and demonstrate how we're fighting back against.
You're the gloomy one, Ben.
But you earned a drink, is what I'm going to say. So come along for the event, yes, of course, but also for the drink afterwards. I think you've deserved it to our sole remaining listener. You have earned your drink. And Tom, are you going to go to that event? I'm going to go.
I have a clash, unfortunately. I was asked last week to help out with an event that's going on that's related to swimming, and I said, "Oh yeah, 12th of September, that's fine." But I'll be listening back, and I'll be asking you, Ben, to tell me what happens.
No drink for you then, Tom.
No drink. No, we're not aiming to have all 4,000 new members become alcoholics, by the way. That's not what we're trying to do. But I certainly am a great believer. Yeah, it's a very great English tradition, isn't it? Having a glass or two of wine and even maybe a beer after we talk these things through and have our speakeasies. But do come along to that. That will be great fun.
Yeah. All right. Well, looking forward to it. And goodbye for now.
Goodbye for now.